Hello and welcome to Lit on Lockdown, where we'll be discussing the fortnight's news. I'm Frances Weetman, editor of Lit, and I'm joined today by Adam Barnett, who is a columnist at Lit. So what's the first subject that you want to talk about today, Adam?
The first subject on the agenda, I think, is a story we could generalize as Boris shambles. Dominic Cummings has been shown the door from Downing Street, along with Lee Kane, formerly the Mirror Chicken. It's another week when we have fresh reasons to rejoice that we have such people in government. Yeah,
quite. I don't know what your thoughts were on what's just happened, but one of the things I was thinking, as there were wonderful photographs of Dominic Cummings leaving somewhat dramatically from number 10 whilst holding a box. I just remember thinking, how much political capital has Boris Johnson spent on Dominic Cummings? We had the entire scandal about Dominic Cummings possibly breaking lockdown measures in the first lockdown, and where he gave a speech to like a whole kind of press pack in the Rose Garden. And this was like real headline making news. And I just remember thinking like the number of people who are actually going to pay attention to the lockdown rules will probably have reduced as a direct result of Boris Johnson failing to sack Cummings when that happened. And now I'm thinking he's being sacked now supposedly because of some mean texts that were written about Boris Johnson's partner. Is the line that he draws really just about protecting his partner, which is, you know, I think that's a fair reason to fire people who are around him, but is that really the line and not completely reducing any effectiveness of lockdown measures?
The fact that Cummings was sacked over this sort of internal squabble, rather than jeopardizing public health with his trip to the castle, says everything, I think. It will be quite a late conversion to chivalry on the part of the Prime Minister, if that were his chief motivation. I think what he's mainly concerned about is public relations, and that's been foremost in his mind since, for the whole of the pandemic, certainly. So the main issue is that the Prime Minister was changing around his inner circle and worrying about public relations when he was supposed to be making a decision about whether or not to have a second lockdown. This is very serious. And it seems that even the decision to have a second lockdown was influenced by these internal wranglings. Someone leaked the fact that there might be a second lockdown to the press, and that meant that Johnson had to make a decision sooner and announce it a couple of days earlier. This is an encapsulation of how the Prime Minister's vacillating narcissism is influencing public health directly. And I don't see how that's going to change simply by having someone who's a bit more media savvy at the top of his team.
One of the things I saw, which I thought was kind of amusing, but also had a ring of truth to it, was that, one of the people who was fired in this whole scandal was Lee Kane, who was Boris Johnson's head of communications. And I remember seeing somebody on Twitter saying something like, there was someone who was running the communication strategy at number 10, because the one thing they've been consistently bad on is communications throughout this entire pandemic. That's been the one real failure. And I just thought that had a ring of truth to it, because they have abysmally failed in terms of communication strategy. So goodness knows, maybe they'll improve with whoever they take on. So do you think this whole row about Dominic Cummings is a massive distraction or not?
It's not a distraction, it is important in itself. He's been a very destructive force in our politics. I'm more concerned about the way the government is distracted from its responsibilities. It does seem to care much more about internal personality squabbles, who gets what job, much the same as you'd expect from someone who went to the kind of schools where that sort of thing is important. There he is cloistered with his senior advisors, handing out baubles and titles and asking them effectively King Lear style to show who loves him the most, and then they get rewarded, when he ought to be making sure people aren't dying every day from a deadly virus. It's his distraction that I think should be the story. It seems to have influenced even the decision about when and whether to have a national lockdown. So it can't be said to be a sideshow. It's not as if he's able to do this and his normal responsibilities. We already know he's not doing the bare minimum expected of a prime minister in a health crisis. What we now know is one of the reasons why, because he's getting a advice at home from his fiancée and from dueling advisors and would-be advisors about how best he can win the Rishi vote or whatever it is, be as popular as his chancellor. There's such a threat to people's health and livelihood. Really ought to prompt urgent action. I think he should be removed from office. I don't know why I'm beating around the bush. I think there should be a no confidence vote immediately, or a leadership challenge, or pitchforks. I don't really mind, whichever is quickest. Once you recognise that Boris Johnson is the problem as Prime Minister and shouldn't be in that job, the question is just how best to replace him with someone competent.
Yeah.
And if it touches on issues of public mandates and having prime ministers that haven't been subject to a general election, that's something we can worry about once people aren't dying every day. I think he'd actually win some points by saying, you know what, I might have many political skills, let's say. This is him talking, not me. He may have many political skills, but in the current crisis, it might be better if someone else steps in temporarily, and then we'll see how things go after that. I think a lot of people would respect that. It won't happen in a million years, of course. It'll have to be the actions of other people.
It is funny though, because I think, you know, this is a government that campaigned against unelected bureaucrats in the form of vote leave, and it seems to be a government that's run by unelected bureaucrats, which is precisely why this row at Number 10 has become so significant and has been headline news.
Yeah, and there's just a strain of incompetence that runs through the whole government that means effectively no one can be disciplined or sacked now, certainly never for the right reasons. We've just heard that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has been found to have been bullying civil servants and staff across 3 different departments that she was working in. And the signal from the Prime Minister has been that there'll be no repercussions for that.
We just have a breaking news item here. Don't know whether you've seen.
I've not seen.
Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial code resigns as Boris Johnson backs Priti Patel. Well, that's something. You know, I do think what's at the heart of both Labour anti-Semitism and scandals such as this involving the current Tory party is this complete lack of a personal accountability. There's never been any point where anyone stood up and said, look, I was the problem and I am sorry. But it just hasn't happened.
Yeah, it's considered bad politics to admit any kind of error.
But this is part of the problem, because then you end up in a situation whereby these sorts of political events and the lack of accountability becomes normalized. It becomes accepted that this is just what happens. And you end up pushing further and further towards a politics whereby there's no accountability, and whatever the leader of any given party says, even if it's completely corrupt, goes. And I'm concerned that that's going to erode our democracy to a degree.
Absolutely. Even though people will move on, they don't forget, and it does chip away at public trust in the system and politics. It just lowers the floor. It means that there's suddenly another gutter into which we can all sink, and it just gets worse and worse. The overall standard is dragged down, and what's acceptable expands. And it also doesn't only expand for your own side. Your political enemies can take advantage of that open sewer, the sudden reservoir of bad behavior that you can indulge in and get away with it.
And so on that note, I think we should move on to our next topic, which is the troubles of, well, the trials and tribulations of the Labour Party. You were wanting to talk a little bit about Diane Abbott. What happened with Diane Abbott the other day?
So Diane Abbott got in trouble for speaking on a panel about China with people who had denied the Chinese government's atrocities against Uyghur people. She pled ignorance about the nature of the panel, despite having praised the guest before appearing on it, and also appearing on a similar panel a few weeks earlier. I think the significance of this is it's a reminder of the continuing attempts to make the Labour Party look like a serious party rather than a bag of crankery. And it's a real challenge for Keir Starmer, who at the same time was on Desert Island Discs, trying very hard to come across as a likable human. only to have this detonate underneath him.
It does seem like the sort of electable, sensible chunk of the left, which probably takes up the majority of the Labour Party, if you look at the voting breakdowns for things like the NEC in the last week, that majority is continually being kind of messed around and undermined by this small fringe of the left that, well, I don't know how best to describe them really. They seem to justify authoritarianism and human rights abuses if the perpetrators happen to be wearing a red rosette, which really undermines any kind of moral high ground the Labour Party would hope to have. And I think it's important the Labour Party has a moral high ground as it heads into the next election. Okay, it's going to be in a few years, but at the same rate, it needs that. Especially given this government's track record on things like austerity and poverty and breaking things like international law.
Well, it means that their politics is based on tribalism rather than principle, which I think is not a great way to proceed. There's always been this wing of the left, or variants of it. And what happened in 2015 was it was given central power of the whole party, and we've seen what's happened ever since. And Diane Abbott's, for a long time, had one foot in each of those two camps. I don't have as much sympathy as perhaps I could for Keir Starmer or the majority of the Labour Party and movement, because they have tolerated this for a long time. So they're sort of the co-creators of our current troubles, and you can see it in Starmer's hokey-cokey attempts to discipline Jeremy Corbyn for effectively trashing the Equality and Human Rights Commission report into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He's suspended, and then he's unsuspended by the NEC, and then he has the whip removed, but that's being challenged by the courts and might only last for a few months before it's renewed again. In my opinion, it was partly for the wrong reason as well. That it's what was contained in the report that should have damned Corbyn rather than his response to it, which is merely a symptom of that.
That's it. Personally think that Corbyn's statement in response to the Equality and Human Rights Commission kind of backs up the findings of the Equality and Human Rights Commission report, because it's consistent with the political culture that festered under Jeremy Corbyn and increased. I mean, he said, for instance, that the scale of the problem of anti-Semitism was dramatically exaggerated for political reasons, which the Equality and Human Rights Commission has highlighted as an instance of anti-Semitism. It has said that claims that anti-Semitism was exaggerated for political ends is anti-Semitic. So I can't help but think that it's easy to buy into what Keir Starmer is saying, that Labour anti-Semitism and the entire crisis shouldn't just be put down to one man, or they shouldn't be obsessed with what happens to Jeremy Corbyn. But at the same rate, this situation has come into being partly because of Jeremy Corbyn's attitude, which is what actually led to the crisis in the first place.
Well, it's difficult because he was sort of saying that the concerns around the issue, in his later clarification, he said the concerns around the issue shouldn't be downplayed. In other words, were not exaggerated. But he does believe that the scale of the problem in the party has been overstated.
I thought it was honestly one of the most impressive examples I've ever seen of a non-apology, because he never said sorry. The closest he got to saying sorry for his original comments when he posted his statement in the last week, he said, "I regret the pain this issue has caused," which could be humble, but at the same rate, he's not said, "I am sorry that I have caused this pain." He always writes it in a way as if, you know, it's some third party who is causing this entire problem, when that's not true. It's him.
Yeah, I mean, concerns is a good word. You could be concerned about alien abductions, and you could feel very upset about the threat from them without them actually being a real likelihood.
Yeah,
they have to exist for you to have concerns about them. So it's patronizing.
So I think that concludes this fortnight's episode of Lit on Lockdown, and we'll be here in 2 weeks to discuss the news.